Thank you. So this is the last paper before our roundtable, which is coming from Jenny Leith on doubting desire, which is a lovely critical question to be concluding our papers on. As you all know, Jenny's been doing her postdoctoral research work through this Quest for God project. So great to have you next up. Jenny, over to you.
Thanks, Amy. And yeah, thanks you for all the wonderful papers. I kind of want to go back and rewrite this in the light of them, but it's not time, so I'll just hope that we can talk about it in discussion. So as Amy said, this paper explores the role of doubt in forming desire for God, and more particularly the way in which social relations can be thought of as part of how we form a fruitful kind of doubt about desire for God. So as you'll know, the relationship between doubt and desire for God is well established in the negative theological tradition. And this kind of doubting is meant to train the Christian to better attend to God, opening up new possibilities of encountering the divine in surprising ways. And there's been a tendency in the tradition to focus on individual contemplative prayer as the primary practice through which this kind of loving attention to God is trained. But I'm wanting to extend that a bit here and think about how social contexts can also be places in which the Christian can learn to resist their tendency to attempt to know God in complete or finalizable ways. And so can be part of training us to cultivate a contemplative quality of attention. And I'll be exploring this primarily engagement with the work of Rowan Williams and Janet Soskis. I should briefly explain why I think this matters. It's not just a kind of arcane question. I think that an unintended consequence of what's sometimes called the ecclesial turn in theology has been the suggestion that God is to be encountered only or mainly within established ecclesial and Christian practices. And that seems to me like an unintended limiting of how we understand God's ways of the world, and so too of where and how we expect to encounter God. And this is related to a tendency that Janet Soskis highlights to create a hierarchy between spiritual and practices and the rest of day-to-day life. And there's a quote on the handout to that effect. So I'm interested here in pushing back a bit about some of the kind of unintended ways that Christian theology has suggested that there's only a particular set of spiritual practices through which growth can take place and desire for God can be developed, and in reaching for a bit of a more integrated sense of how desire for God can be formed amidst the messiness of shared daily life. So I'll begin by looking very briefly at the way the negative theological tradition has tended to understand the role played by doubt in forming desire for God. David Neuheiser asks, what does it mean to desire a God who transcends knowledge and experience? And I think we might take this as the question at the heart of negative theology. Grappling with what it means to desire a transcendent God has generated doubt about the knowledge and love for God that we think we have, in part because of the inadequacy of language to properly frame knowledge and love of God. And the need for this kind of doubt is also, of course, related to human sinfulness. So because of both our finitude and our sinfulness, negative theology can train us in a kind of provisionality about what it is to speak of and to desire God. However, it's worth stressing that provisionality isn't the final word in learning to attend to God in this tradition, so it's not a negation all the way down. And this isn't because there's some kind of core of set of statements about God, as a kind of basic description of the divine life that we can straightforwardly assert and that we can know what we mean when we do. Rather, it's not a negation all the way down, because to say something of God leads us to seek particular ways of life and to turn away from other ways of living. So just in the attempt of grappling with that kind of provisionality. So Rowan Williams in particular argues that practices of unsaying or negating are fundamentally about learning to recognize that we are the object of a creator's unending loving attention, and about learning to receive and live in God's loving gaze. So in the light of all of this, contemplative prayer has, with good reason, been seen as a fruitful practice in training a doubt that reveals precisely these kind of limits. And so too, as a practice that helps to train our ability to lovingly attend to God, because of the way in which it trains us to receive God's attention. Contemplative prayer offers a posture of attention towards God in which the prayer opens themselves up to receiving from God in ways they don't control, seeking to rely not on their pre-existing picture of God, but being open to attending to and so desiring God as God's self, and something that Dennis Turner touches on the handout. And there's an expectation that God will be encountered in unexpected ways in contemplative prayer, both as absence and as overwhelming presence. With all that being said, I think there's a couple of qualifications that we should make about the role of contemplative prayer and how it can form desire in this way. So first of all, we're not only limited in our knowledge of God, but also in our understanding of our own desires and motivations. So we therefore need to be aware of our tendency to deceive ourselves. So it's not just that we have stunted or bad desires, but it's also that we don't often know what our desires even are. And consequently, even in contemplative prayer, we can be deceived by ourselves. We can think we are seeking God, when actually we may be seeking an experience of encountering God. Doubting our desires then means not simply knowing that our desires are inadequate, but also knowing that we do not know all the ways in which this inadequacy shows itself. And my second qualification is informed by Williams's sense of our task as the task of the negative tradition as involving continuing to try and make sense of our experience of seeking to attend to God, albeit in always provisional and revisable ways. So for Williams, the process of making sense is characterized by patience, because it must be true to the demands of what one is engaging. When God is the object one is engaging, the forms of contemplation demanded go beyond language and the usual ways we try to make sense of the world. Nonetheless, Williams is clear in affirming the necessity of going on speaking, even whilst acknowledging that the task of representation will never be complete. So there's risk and vulnerability involved in this kind of speech, venturing judgments whilst also resisting making these final. And I think you can glimpse something in that of the dialectic between apophasis and cataphasis in the tradition, in which on the one hand, our caution about what we say about God is always in service of what we do still say about God. And on the other hand, what we say about God has to continually be disrupted so that we can learn to speak of God and to attend to God more faithfully. But when this dialectic stays at the level of individual practice, the scope for this kind of disruption remains quite limited. So Soskis, for example, understands the need for disruption as part of the inherently social nature of prayerful attention to God. She argues that to be fully human, even to praise God, we need others who are different from ourselves. And she goes on to argue that speech is preeminently a social possession, and without speech, there would be no praise, no prayer, no willed. So I want to turn now to thinking about the importance of social relations in the process of doubting and properly forming our desires for God. I should note here that contemplative prayer is, of course, widely understood to be a practice that's not undertaken on its own, but as one part of a whole life that is oriented to desiring God. Given that the bulk of the early negative tradition was written in monastic contexts, the assumption is that this practice will form just one part of a broader liturgical context. Additionally, contemplation of God is understood to also train us to better attend to those around us. And we should also note there's a strand of the tradition that understands the ability to attend to God to be trained through secular practices. So talk about, for example, Simone Weil on the role of school studies. But what I'm arguing here goes a bit further in that, firstly, I stress a more disruptive element to corporate worship rather than just that corporate worship is part of the pattern of training desire. And I also argue that social situations can themselves be the site of contemplative encounters with God. So they can themselves be part of training our attention to God in their own way. They don't just flow out of that. So we'll begin by looking at how social interactions can supplement contemplative prayer in training loving attention to God. In focus here is the need for contemplative prayer to be informed by, to be disrupted by, the images that other people have of God and their ways of naming God. The Dennis Turner, amongst others, has highlighted how in contemplation there's a temptation that must always be resisted to try and possess God through making God in our own image. And there's a quote here about making God a mere godlet of our own invention that's higher up on the handout. So whilst wordless prayer can strip away some of the support structures for these false gods that we tend to foster, it can also allow us to implicitly still operate with these images. Often we don't even know that we have these implicit images of God until we're confronted with a different image. Unexpected, overwhelming images of God are, of course, part of what has been encountered in the tradition of contemplative prayer. But I think there's also something valuable about receiving other people's descriptions and images of God. In particular, I think there's an important role for public positive affirmations of God, which explicitly don't reflect those who are socially dominant. And this might mean, for example, drawing on feminist and womanist theology and liturgy. Might also mean using alternative descriptions of the persons and relations of God, such as creator, redeemer, sustainer, to supplement and kind of disrupt the Trinitarian formula. I know this is something that makes Simon nervous, so we can always talk about it later on. And so I think that layering up kind of positive pictures of God in this disruptive and destabilizing way can help us to displace what Turner calls our cozy godlets. Moreover, to be able to have our desires disrupted in this way by others, we need to apply the same, or at least a similar, negative or contemplative approach to social relations as we have to our relation with God. So Sostis again notes that some Orthodox theologians suggest that to say man is in the image of God is to say that man is mystery, because God is mystery. There is a proper kind of apophasis that we ought to accord to each other, as there is a sense that in standing in front of another, we stand on holy ground. The mystery of the other means that we don't know what they apprehend of God's mystery. We don't know what has been revealed to them. We need, therefore, to be open to and expectant of receiving distinctive insights from the other. However, the kind of possessive sinfulness that we've noted as closing us off from experiencing God as God's self can also manifest itself here in an inattentive sense of superiority to other people, the egotistic deception that we already know what the other knows and that they have nothing of worth to give to me. This extends also to the accounts that others give of God. And this kind of inattention can also take the form of seeing the other in relation to how they can fill my needs and desires, which is something Simone Weil is particularly worried about, as we've seen. So a negative or a contemplative approach to social relations requires us to accept the mysterious opaqueness of the other. Accepting this opaqueness has implications for both our understanding of others' desires and also our own desires. It leads us to recognize that we require this perspective of others to know ourselves. As Williams argues, part of not knowing the shape of our own desires very well means we'll misread our desires until we're confronted with the desires of others. And our ability to perceive what we desire and to know whether that desire is good or not is clarified through others, as what Williams calls the barriers of egotistic fantasy are broken by the sheer brute presence of other persons. So in a similar way to the way that speech to and about God individually is part of learning to attending to God, there's a sense in which we become who we are through the conversation. We can see then that corporate and conversational practices shouldn't be understood as separate from contemplation of God. Rather, these social practices can also lead us into deeper knowledge and love of God. Whilst individual contemplative prayer is a central practice in learning to attend to God, I think we should also understand our desires to be shaped not just when we wrestle with them in the unconsoled difficulty of our wordless prayer, but also through social encounter. And this is so because of the way that the opaqueness of others acts as a check on false images of God, of one another, and of ourselves, and leads us to continue to renegotiate our sense of who we are before God. An awareness of our capacity for self-deception results in making other people intrinsic to learning to lovingly attend in this way. And so these kind of conversational practices become important for the kinds of provisional and finite ways that we are able to make sense of God and of what it means to love and be loved by God. The alternative pictures that come to light through these interactions can help to dislodge the ways we imagine God in our own image or through the lens of our experience of relationships. And I want to go just one step further in the final few minutes. I'm not just arguing that applying an analogous apophaticism to social relations supplements contemplative prayer, and so, in a sense, trains us to better contemplate God in silence, but that social relations can themselves be the site of contemplative encounters with God. So, as we've seen, Williams places a strong emphasis on the way that receiving God's attention can reshape and disrupt the things we think we know, not least our understanding of ourselves. This is also true of receiving the attention of those around us. Understanding the mystery and giftedness of the other in the way that Soskis has implied has implications for the way those around us can be part of mediating God's loving attention. There is scope for learning to receive God's attention through receiving the attention of others in ways that disrupt our prior sense of ourselves and our situations. I should note that we really need to be cautious about kind of power relations and the limits of receptivity here. There's obviously violent and oppressive ways in which we can relate to one another, and not all attention is generous and aiming at the others, unfolding and flourishing. So I'm not proposing receptivity here as a kind of a stable virtue irrespective of context. And there's thinking to be done about how we discern what is to be received. But I do think nonetheless that the posture of openness to receiving unexpected gifts through being the object of others' attention can be affirmed as central to contemplative formation in social relations. So I'm arguing here that being attended to, learning to be objects of attention, can be a central part of the process of learning to desire God. More specifically, I think that being attended to by others can make us aware of divine attention. One way in which this can happen is through a negative approach to social interactions, allowing situations to be reframed in a way that opens us up to receiving God's loving attention, and so also to returning it. I think we can see an instance of what this might look like in Stuart Jesson's extension of Vay's account of attention, in which he seeks to move attention beyond the private operation of the individual soul to being something that can be shared and where there can be a joint subject of attention. So in the context of Vay's work on suffering and compassion, Jesson makes the argument that in understanding attention as being, in some cases, an irreducibly social phenomenon, compassion might in turn also be thought of as something that can be shared. The term joint attention refers to the capacity to be aware of another's awareness of the object of one's own awareness, and involves shared orientation to the object of attention. Compassion, meanwhile, concerns questions, whether it's asking what Vay calls the redemptive question, what are you going through? Or listening compassionately to the question, why is this happening to me? As Jesson puts it, if I ask, what are you going through, then I must learn to pay attention not just to the other, but to that which the question, why am I being hurt, directs me. I must learn to pay attention with the questioning other. And Jesson illustrates the relationship between joint attention and compassion through relating his experience of being unemployed and having, after a long series of unsuccessful attempts, failed once again to get an interview for a much desired job. He describes a series of encounters with friends who in various ways failed to join in with his attention to his situation. And he then describes an encounter in which attention and compassion are genuinely shared. This is the long quote from Jesson on your handout. The thing that's changed here for Jesson is what he calls the simple fact that I sense that someone else has attended to the problem that I am concerned with in the way that I am concerned with it. So it's this that somehow alters the significance that the situation has for him. His friend's attention to and with him changes his experience of the current situation. And it only does this because she doesn't try and change it, but enters into it as it is. He says, she doesn't force her hope onto me as a consolation that should drive away my initial reaction. But because we are attending jointly to my troubles, to her daughter, her own hope in the face of my own fears, which are deeper, her own hope in the face of her own fears, which are deeper and more serious, affects me, and it bleeds into my own. So attention should shape then both the one attending and the one being attended to. As Tim Jenkins says, it can't be a kind of passive act, leaving one or both sides unchanged. And this willingness to enter into another situation on their terms involves a form of a kind of generous attention, we might say, putting aside one's own agenda and the desire to tidy up their suffering. In the sharing of attention, consolation is truly generated, and the troubling situation is seen in a subtly different light, reflected through the other's attention to it. So I think we could understand the experience of compassion and consolation that emerges through the sharing of attention as an experience of God's loving attention, which the presence of the other person enables us to receive in a new way. And Jessica Martin, which is the other quote in your handout, offers another iteration of this kind of sense of how this kind of reframing can happen. So our learning to attend is as those who are recipients of an unending divine attention, who must learn to share in this attentiveness, both to ourselves and to others. And we've seen from Williams that coming to understand our being is contingently dependent on being open to disruption by God, means we should carry this openness to contingent disruption into our social relations. And this is expressed in both in who one pays attention to and who one is prepared to receive attention from. Core to this way of understanding what it means to lovingly attend to God, then, is an openness to coming to see things in new and surprising ways, from perspectives that are not contained within us. I should leave it there. I hope I've shown there are resources for kind of extending negative theology in this way, and for so understanding social relations and interactions as sites where loving attention can be trained.
Lovely, thank you, Jenny, so much. What a super final paper to launch us into the threads that seems to bring together. The attending to the lived out that was a question earlier in our previous session. Friends, we have some time for direct questions on this paper before we have our more synthesizing reflective discussion. So over to you. If anyone has any questions, just wave your hand. Is it Chuck? Go ahead.
Thank you, Jenny. That was really terrific. And I was on a dissertation this summer on a theology of Samaritan compassion. And so I'll see if I can get that guy to send you if you're interested in it, you might find it fun. There was a lot of overlap, I thought, but you're doing something very different, and I think it's great. I have a question just about the structure of the paper itself. What happens to doubting? It felt like you started with doubting, and at the end, you're doing this really great stuff with compassion. Mm-hmm. But how do you identify the relationship between those two? Mm-hmm. So that's just that. It's a request for more.
Yeah. Shall I just yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, inevitably it's kind of a more compact form of a longer paper. And I feel like, yeah, can't really see the wood for the trees in terms of which moves are important. So thanks for asking that, Chuck. Yeah, I would see it as kind of the ability for kind of this joint attention to happen rests on understanding ourselves as not something that can be kind of self-possessed. So it's resting on this kind of doubting of the adequacy of our own self-knowledge and of our knowledge of God and one another. So it's that kind of acknowledgement of the opaqueness of God and of humans to one another that leads to the ability to kind of attend in this way, and therefore for compassion to be generated in the way that Stuart Jessen's talking about.
It strikes me also, Jenny, that the social character of what you're describing is also a reintroduction of doubt in itself. And if we are reliant on the other to tell us who the self is, that can come as a surprise. That can introduce doubt in the sense that it might offer a sense of who we are that we didn't expect.
Yeah, it can be kind of destabilizing, and it's not, that's a helpful point to emphasize, that it's not the end of doubt, that point to which the attention is received, but can kind of be part of a kind of a deeper process. When Tal was speaking earlier, I was thinking about the way he talked about kind of the way that surprise kind of is operative in this, and that we don't necessarily realize what we lacked or what we were desiring until it's kind of fulfilled in an unexpected way, or there's kind of a role for kind of eruption in new and unexpected ways, if I understood it in what you were saying, Tal. And so I think that's also true in the way that doubt can kind of appear, and can it's not something that we necessarily thought that we would doubt, but it can be kind of destabilized in the way that you were talking about, Amy.
Tal, you're nodding away. Would you like to come in on that point?
No, I'm okay. I mean, I guess I'm tossing around my mind, various words to capture the phenomenon that you're talking about, and so maybe that indicates that I wonder if there are alternatives to doubt for capturing what you're trying to put your finger on. This is probably not the right thing, but there's at least an element of wonder in it, and but anyway, that's what I was nodding, but also thinking that over. I didn't mean to jump in. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely see it as connected to the kind of abundance and plenitude that we've been talking about. That it's because we can't kind of possess and predict that there's kind of things can be disrupted in this way.
John, could we come on to your question?
Thank you very much, Jenny. It's great. I'm very struck by that phrase, the mysterious opaqueness of the other, or opacity of the other. Maybe this connects with the doubt issue, because it's part of your view that not just that the other is opaque, but that we are also opaque to ourselves. So is just a pure question. Is attentiveness to the other in all their opacity a way of rendering myself less opaque to myself? I mean, in other words, is there a kind of reciprocity here?
So can you say a bit more? Sorry, I feel like.
Well, it just seems that the project of self-understanding is particularly difficult if I'm opaque to myself, if I can't understand my own desires. So are you suggesting that dispelling that learning to understand myself better is facilitated by encounters with the other rather than self-reflection? I mean, I just want to try and identify the role of
thank you. Sorry, yes, that's really helpful. I'd say that's exactly what I'm suggesting, that it's not that you kind of give up on the project of trying to understand the self, but that you so I guess Ron Williams talks about it in the suspicion of suspicion. It's not you kind of move away from treating it as some kind of puzzle to be solved, that if you just kind of reflect on the self enough, that you can kind of grapple your way to kind of some essence that can be grasped, but that it's precisely through kind of keeping on, kind of attending to the other, that we come to both understand the self better, but also realize that we're never going to come to this kind of puzzle solving understanding of the self.
Friends, we will have to leave our exchanges there on that paper to leave room for our time as a whole group. Just to give you a sense of the structure of that time, exactly as your agenda suggests, we're going to have 5 minutes from 3 speakers that are a little bit more reflective. So hopefully drawing on some of the things we've already been talking about, but also introducing some new ideas as well for a more synthesizing conversation. So hopefully we'll get the chance to draw on that thread that you've just offered us as well, Jenny, as we continue on. So very many thanks to you for that paper. And we move on then next to Professor Sarah Coakley. Over to you.
Thank you, Amy. I'd just like to raise 3 points or comments on this wonderful day. Of course, the comments have changed during the day, so perhaps they're not as clear as they might have been last night. The first question I want to ask, which is a question for the whole group, some of which has been meeting now for about 3.5 years, and that is, have we arrived at a point where we might be able to begin to give a kind of typology of different views of desire in the Western philosophical and theological tradition? This is a sort of historical and genealogical issue, but I don't think I can find anywhere any good article or even book that is able to provide this. And it seems time to try and attempt it. When we first started our group, we began, of course, with Plato and the whole tradition of Eros, and we then traced how he was received in the Neoplatonists and the some of the early Christian Platonists, and then the mystical traditions. And then later we went back and started again with Aristotle and traced what he had to say about desire and appetites through the scholastic tradition. And we began to think that we had a bit of a hold on what was going on with this category, at least in the Western tradition. When we hit the modern period, everything went mad because to some extent, the people we were looking at that point, the obvious people from Descartes onwards, had of course inherited strands of either Platonic or Aristotelian influence, but they were also doing very new things, and they were using new words in their own languages to batten onto this very complicated set of family resemblances between different notions of desire. And I think we're still struggling with this kind of modern mess. I found Chris's paper today particularly exciting because it seems to me that Kant is really a sort of pivot figure who is still drawing on much of what he's inherited, but pointing into and towards a secular realm. So here's just a challenge for the group. Maybe we should together write the definitive Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on the meaning of desire, because the current Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article by Tim Schroeder is really very demeaningly narrow and analytic. So that's point number 1. I just want to know whether we are in any kind of agreement about what desire is, whether it's an anthropological category, whether it's a metaphysical principle, what its relationship to will and intellect is, and so on and so forth. My second point is related, and it draws on what we've learned today, I think, from comparing Fiona's paper with a couple of others. That is there something about secular modernity which, as it were, crashes the notion of desire and its richness that has preceded it and reduces it to lack of some sort, or reduces it to sexual attraction, or reduces it to something a bit more sinister as the will to power, for instance? When we remove what might be called the metaphysical backcloth that we get either with the Platonic forms or the notion of God, or even a vaguer sense of ineffable transcendence, as we had in John's paper, is that what happens? And is that why Levinas seems to be so stuck in his disjunction between lack on the one hand and something else, the re-invitation of the notion of God on the other? So is there a particular story about modernity and desire that we might begin to be able to trace here? The third point relates crucially to Jenny's lovely little paper we've just heard, but also to what Claire said at the beginning about devotion and her own current research. And that is, what are the forms of spiritual practice, whether they be socially mediated or individual mystical, that, as it were, reintroduce us positively to the realm of metaphysical desire, which seems to have been, as it were, sidelined in modernity. And so all that richness of anthropological and metaphysical reflection becomes contracted. So what are the conditions under which we rediscover that metaphysical notion of desire? And I'm particularly interested in this at the moment because I'm writing myself on when practices fail. In other words, when the great mantra, McIntyrean mantra of the necessity of practices can easily seduce us into the idea that practices inevitably produce a richer realm of ethical and spiritual reflection. But our contemporary world may well suggest otherwise, that the practices of 90% of the Western world watching pornography every day, or doing violent computer games, or engaging in militaristic displays of violence, are practices that actually stunt that perception ethically. And in particular, in relation to the things that we do privately at home on our screens, I think there's rather little public ethical reflection on how these may be spiritually stultifying precisely as habituses that we are inhabiting. So what is the opposite of that? What is the condition under which the capacity for response to the transcendent notion of desire becomes reactivated? And does that necessarily happen in religious practices? I don't think so. I think religious practices often help us to resist what Jenny has called disruption or transformation, unfortunately. So this is a huge arena of, I think, ethical concern if we are interested in this richer metaphysical notion of desire that we've been exploring in several of the papers today. Thank you.
Very many thanks. We won't do immediate responses. We'll go straight on to our next voice, which is Professor David McPherson. Over to you, David.
All right, thank you very much. So I thought I'd just speak a little bit to what I've been thinking about in relationship to this topic, which is if we're going to think about desire for God or the quest for God, I think, sort of in line with some of the other papers, we have to think, especially John's paper and Fiona's paper, about the our condition as human beings. So our human condition, but also this goes to Sarah's point. We also have to think about our modern condition, how that shapes our conception of God, our desire for God, and why God is needed in our lives. So at the Virginia workshop, I sort of gave a first go at thinking about the topic of spiritual alienation as something fundamental to our human condition, but which I think is also exacerbated within the conditions of modernity, within our secular age, within sort of the pressures towards disenchantment, towards distractedness, what Pascal calls diversion, certain kinds of forms of uprootedness of modern life, and certain Promethean tendencies, I think, are there as well. But I think I want to focus a little bit on what I see as sort of three perennial forms of spiritual alienation, and maybe think about how does the quest for God connect up with these kinds of forms of alienation. The first is what we can call self-alienation. This is, I think John touched on this in his talk, where John appealed to Eleanor Stump's recent work, which is also present in her book, Wandering in Darkness, this issue of a lack of wholeheartedness or a lack of integration. So the ways that we can be sort of alienated from ourselves or alienated from we find ourselves divided with two wills, as Augustine put it in the Confessions. I think this is part of our human condition. And how might the desire for God allow us to overcome this alienation from ourselves? How might we be reintegrated around a love for God? And so how does that allow a kind of wholeheartedness or integration? The second is our alienation from others, including the divine other, oftentimes through experiences of shame or guilt, or even the experience of loneliness that I think is a fundamental part of the human condition. So how does seeing the world as sort of maybe charged with the grandeur of God, where God, the world is ultimately personal, can this help us to find a way towards more loving relations with others, greater integration with others? And then the last kind of alienation is alienation from the world. One of my favorite novelists is Walker Percy, American novelist. His book, particularly The Moviegoer, is sort of this sort of, he calls it existential dislocation. That one of the way he sort of begins with this question where he's in the Korean War, kind of lying in the muck next to a dung beetle, and says sort of, how am I any different than this dung beetle? And so he kind of comes to this conclusion that I'm different because I'm alienated from my environment. That it sets him on this philosophical search. And there's a way I want to bring out how philosophy, or sort of, is an integral part of the spiritual life. It's part of our alienation, that it responds to it. It also exacerbates it. So you think about, in the metaphysics, Aristotle says that philosophy begins with wonder, which is really a sense of like being as in Martha Nussbaum's translation, being at a loss in the world, a sense of disorientation, a sense of, what Percy calls their existential dislocation. But how can philosophy be a part of overcoming alienation in this sense? And so in all this, I'm Hegel's definitely in the background, and particularly Hegel's reading of the story of the Garden of Eden as not merely a fall, but also a rise into moral, spiritual self-consciousness. That part of coming into moral and spiritual self-consciousness is, this sense of alienation from ourselves, from others, and also from the world around us. And so kind of taking that as a framing for, our quest for God as a quest to overcome alienation, our separation, our estrangement from what Charles Taylor calls the place of fullness. So I think that's, our sort of our experience of exile from that place of fullness, I think is central to, I think, how I think is best to try to understand the quest for God. But then it's sort of a further question of how does God fit into that? And I think one other point to emphasize, I think there's a danger sort of in that kind of Hegelian account of a rise, that the fall is really a rise, that we lose the sense of fallenness. For instance, you think about someone like John Hick, who has this, wants to revise the Augustinian view of the fall and say, well, it's really, the fall sort of represents our distance from this ideal of perfection, right? That we're imperfect, we're made in the image of God, but we're to move into the likeness of God. And I think there's a lot that's important in that picture, but I think it's a bit too tame if we say that we're merely imperfect. I think, for instance, of Wittgenstein, who says people are religious to the extent that they believe themselves not so much to be imperfect as sick. Anyone who is halfway decent will think of himself as utterly imperfect, but the religious person thinks of himself as wretched. And so I think, for instance, of Pascal here as well, right? The awareness of the sort of our human wretchedness, but also our greatness, that we stand in need of redemption, right? And I think, we see that, I think in the Kantian, there's something of that in the Kantian picture, sort of the wretchedness of the human condition that we're trying to pull ourselves out of, right? And there's a role for human effort and human will. But what I'm really interested in is sort of the role of grace. How do we conceptualize grace in human life? Something to which we have to be receptive. How can grace, as an unmerited given good, how can that help us to overcome our spiritual alienation? So there's certainly a role for effort or human will, but how does grace, a kind of receptivity to an unmerited given good, enable us to be at home in the world, so to speak, be at one with ourselves, be at one with others, and in the world. So those are just some reflections. So the sense of like we're sick, we stand in need of healing. Healing, of course, that comes from root words meaning to make whole or to make holy. So those root words all come together. So I think this idea of being sick means that we stand in need of healing, some way of being made whole. And so what I'm sort of trying to think about is, how do we think about the role of grace in being made whole, something to which we need to be receptive. So go back to some of those remarks that we were discussing earlier. So I'll leave off with that, but that's sort of the questions I've been puzzling with. And as I've been hearing the talks, it's questions I'm trying to work out for myself. So.
David, thank you so much. And we move on to the third of our speakers to launch us into the wider conversation. So Professor Chuck Mathewes, over to you.
Okay, so actually there's a great deal of overlap between both Sarah and David's comments and some of mine. I'll just have two big points. On the one hand, Sarah was talking about a typology of theologies or philosophies of desire. As I was listening today, I was writing down a number of different ways in which you can think about desire, to borrow a bit from Tal, as a dialectical concept. And here are some of the ways in which it seems to me desire is an interesting concept for straddling different dimensions of our lives. First of all, it seems innately fleshly, but it also seems in some ways transcendent. Secondly, it seems clearly about the subject. It's about subjectivity, but it's also in that way trans-subjective. It seems to be a way to get out of our subjectivity in some ways, so that the cosmos is asking us to desire it in some ways. Thirdly, it is, and this borrows a bit from, I think, what Chris was saying, desire is simultaneously sometimes perhaps experienced as free or spontaneous, but also as something that draws or compels us or lures us out. So there's agency and passivity in it as well. And then with Claire, you have this idea that desire is simultaneously punctual and yet also extended over time. There's a temporal structure to desire, so that it can be owned in the instant, but also in some way stretched out, distentio in Augustine's terms, but it can be extended in that way as well. And then for a number of you, the way in which desire is simultaneously something known and something that is surprising or yet to be discovered. It seems to me that in a certain way, in the beginning of the Confessions, in the first paragraph or so, Augustine says, "Sed quis invocate nesciens te," but who can call on you who does not know you? And that question of how we are to seek an unknown end while still knowing the end in some inchoate way, that relationship of knownness and mystery seems also innate to desire. So all those are just kind of dialectical dimensions, it seems to me, of desire. And if someone was to write a kind of typology of the philosophies of desire, something around those would be fun too, a kind of a phenomenology of the various dimensions, or the registers in which we can talk about desire. The other thing I was going to say, and this goes back to both David and Sarah, on modernity, although it's a little more historically specific than modernity. Some of my best friends are philosophers. I love philosophers very much. You're all quite wonderful. You are occasionally a little too ahistorical for my taste. And there's, as Sarah pointed out, and David too, there is an interesting question here about whether in this particular historical moment, broadly modernity, but even more so, I would say, in the period since the late 19th century, with the advent of an advertising culture and then a consumer culture on top of that, we have become a certain kind of creature that is in some interesting ways, this is not a gigantic Heideggerian statement, but just a kind of modest historical statement, in some interesting ways, a different kind of creature than the kinds of agents we used to be. So Albert Hirschman, who's a social theorist, a brilliant social theorist, wrote a book in the 70s called The Passions and the Interests, in which he argued for a kind of important change in moral psychology and the accounts of human rationality and stuff in the 18th century, between what he called a passion-based psychology and an interest-based psychology. I wonder if that might serve as an inspiration for us in thinking about the ways that living into a culture where many billions of dollars are spent not only in direct advertising, but in the psychological researching of how to make us want certain things or want them more, which is an industry that's now been in existence for a century. How this kind of industrial levels of attention to shaping our moral psychology may be affecting us, and may be affecting us precisely around desire. I have a weird intuition. I don't know if anyone could work this up into a grant application, but I have a weird intuition that languages of desire may be more operative in 20th century psychology than previous centuries. Maybe there was a language of honor, or a language of esteem, or other kinds of languages. Yes, clearly, for people like Augustine, for people like Pascal, there's a long tradition of desire and eros that runs through this whole, the whole millennia, several millennia now we've had of this. But I wonder if alongside that, something has happened to the discourse of desire in the last century or so that we need to register. And that's moved desire as an index more centrally into our center of attention in that way. The old psychologist Erich Fromm, I found this just after reading some of the stuff yesterday, wrote in a book called On Disobedience and Other Essays. He talked about the human in the 20th century as homo consumens, consuming man. And I think there's something interesting about that a discussion of desire today really ought to address. And that's it. And the last thing I'll say is that I loved the way this presentation went with these very brief papers. It feels to me like this is the right way to do things. A 15 to 20 minute page paper, 15 to 20 minutes, not page, paper, and then discussion. That strikes me as an exceptionally great way to have a pretty rich and diverse conversation. And that's it. Thank you.
So thank you. And there's already hands going up. I can see them already. So Claire, I saw you first. Before I come to you though, I will just note, I suspect this is going to be very rich. So I'm going to encourage you to use the chat function as well. If there are smaller points or interconnections between papers that you want to note as the questions and conversation continue, do let's use that. And I will be keeping an eye on that to sort of note things to help us weave our way through this. But first off, Claire, you were quick off the mark.
Well, thank you all three of you for those responses. Really, all of them really good. I just want to begin by affirming Chuck's point. I think that was so important, what you said about I guess you could call it a new science of desire, and certainly not a disinterested science, but rather techniques for monetizing people's desire and attention. And just as you say, exactly as you say, how would we even think about the kind of beings that has made us when we're always absorbed in that culture? We can't really, well, I guess we can step back from it. We can go on a retreat or that sort of thing. But and perhaps it's when you go on, when you do withdraw from it that you can really begin to take account of its effects. So I just thought that was really important point. It's not something we've talked much about in this project, but I think it's not incidental. It's really fundamental. But I want to also return to Sarah's points. I really loved the way you reflected, Sarah, on these questions. And I guess this, so diagnosing a contraction of desire within modernity, let's say, in a slightly sort of vague way, I think that's really interesting, and it seems to mirror historically something that is, or something that I see as part of our human tendency, which is that we have a desire, an open-ended or infinite spiritual desire, and that desire is constantly being contracted. That's what idolatry is, really. And so I think that seeing it that way, that it's that the turning away from that open open spiritual desire is not, I don't see it so much dualistically as if you're facing in God's over there in one direction, then you turn away towards the world, but rather that, I guess, seeing it a bit more panentheistically, that you can, it just shrinks down, it just contracts to something that's not in itself bad, that is in fact, that could in fact be a channel for perhaps pursuing the more open desire, but when it becomes a contraction, then that more that deeper desire is lost sight of. And so we, in a way, what Sarah, you were diagnosing within the tradition is really another example of that contraction. But it's interesting to think about it historically. And then it also made me think about the fact that, just reflecting on our conversation today, we all of us like this idea of something that is more expansive. We seem to have an aesthetic and an intellectual attraction to a form of desire that isn't so contractive or possessive. You know, there's a lot of, I think we all seem to kind of converge on this recognition that this is something that we want to affirm, and that in itself is interesting to reflect on, the fact that we're drawn to this sort of more open or creative picture, and we can see the limitations, and we can see what's lost in the contraction. And then finally, your question, Sarah, about what are the practices that would return us to a more expansive or more metaphysical notion of desire. And I think the way to think about that is, well, for me, probably quite a Kierkegaardian way, which is, it would be how rather than what. I mean, for example, there's a certain way of doing philosophy. I mean, Tal talked about, there's a certain sort of institutional framework for doing philosophy, and then there's perhaps something else. There's a way of doing philosophy that is perhaps more faithful or more true to the kinds of the more positive conceptions of desire and eros that we're thinking about. And similarly with religious practices, as you pointed out, Sarah, just because a practice is a religious practice doesn't mean that it's, it doesn't mean that it's going to be turning us in the right direction. So again, it's the how rather than the what. And similarly with just ways of being together socially, as Jenny was bringing out. I don't know if it's so much, it's a matter of just finding the right practice or the right technique, but just always bearing in mind this question of how, which I think is what Kierkegaard was all about, really, just constantly opening up that question. I think he was absolutely thinking about precisely these questions about the desire for God and its contraction, and how to sort of somehow maintain the space between the finite and the infinite, and the orientation that keeps that open.
I'm going to suggest that if there are further responses along these threads, we might prioritise those next. Fiona, is that the direction you're going in? Lovely, over to you.
Thanks. And Claire has said a lot of what I wanted to say and added some really interesting points besides. The first thing I was going to say was, again, in response to what Chuck was talking about, and so many interesting and deep things there. But one way that you could put it, this idea of desire contracting, is that we seem to have lost the word desire in one important sense. At least desire as we're understanding it. I mean, to be sure, people use the term desire when they're talking about sex, but that seems to be it. Yeah. So at one level, desire has been reduced to something, a certain kind of desire. And then that raises Sarah's question, which I thought was really interesting. Is there something about secular modernity that reduces desire to lack or sexual desire or whatever? And that just made me think, in the context of some of the things that David was saying about redemption, it made me think of, for example, Roger Scruton's work on whether there could be a redemption without God. And, the answer there is, yes, there can, if we turn to erotic desire, hence all of the Tristan and Isolde stuff that he talked about. And that just seemed to take us back to Negron and the eros agape dualism, because I mean, this isn't an answer to Sarah's question. Is there something about secular modernity that reduces desire to lack? It's not an answer, because that movement is just an expression of the eros agape dualism. And I guess a quick answer would be, yeah, desire is reduced to lack because these people want to reject God and they associate God with agape. And then the only thing that's left is eros, which is dualistically opposed to agape, if you accept this framework. So then I suppose the question would be whether there is an alternative way of understanding things which would avoid this kind of impasse, and which would, I don't know, take us back to this other thing that Chuck was saying, which is that somehow we create ourselves and our world and our options for desiring in the ways we philosophize. I think you said that, Chuck, or something like it, but it just seemed to be a really deep point. So
it's a really
that's a bit
point.
of a
Definitely said it.
but these points just seem to be really important and deep, and I haven't provided any answers, just to say that these are the really big questions, and I think they hinge upon some of the dualisms and distinctions that we've been circling around throughout the day.
Chris, you had something here.
Thanks, I did. I also really appreciated Chuck's comments about the desire industry, but I'm going to be kind of a philosopher and ahistorical, because I suppose it's not so much a golden age and then a contraction, but there's a way in which you could see, yes, the desire industry is all about controllable, fabricated desires, constantly the language of choice, as long as you choose the same. But I suppose even in, you know, the Plato's dialogues, desire is deeply disturbing, isn't it? So Socrates is always a disturbing figure, a kind of barefooted hunter, the magician bewitching souls. And you can see the sophists attempting to close down desire, control it. And that there's a reason why desire gets contracted, because it can be a shattering experience to be gripped by desire, and something which is not amenable to a certain notion of practice. It can pull open a life, shake you down. You know, Plato's divine madness, the divine enthusiasm. So it's, you know, I don't know what you, and in an individual life, it can be hard to know what is a dangerous disintegration of your whole life and what is a wonderful deepening into something more true. And I suppose that's why you need communities of wisdom, and perhaps Kierkegaard's how it's in the intensity of the living, isn't it? And as part of that, the honesty of it. But there's a reason for contraction, because desire is dangerous as well as wonderful, I think. Even appropriate desire, even the good stuff is shattering, potentially.
Chuck, you're poised. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say quickly, I didn't mean, and I hope no one took me to be suggesting that desire is not a good target or a good object of concern. It's precisely because it seems to have been so efficiently weaponized by our kind of late industrial society that it's so interesting, just that we should pay attention to those forces. And the other thing I wouldn't want to pass up on is David's point about grace strikes me as really interesting. And we've said that a couple times with Jenny's stuff as well, that the idea that God is desiring us maybe more primordially than we desire God, that idea. So that, anyway, just if we think about desire, I wouldn't want to let go of the centrality of grace in that. That's all. That was all. Thank you.
Simon.
Yeah, I mean, that was exactly what I was thinking, Chuck. And going back to Jenny's paper and thinking about Rowan Williams' essay, The Body's Grace, which talks an awful lot in an Augustinian mode about the fact that we learn ourselves firstly to be an object of another's desire. And so, you know, if one thinks about how our desires are formed, they're formed by being the object of appropriate desire when we're children, or lacking another's attention, love, desire. But also, as Chris says, desire can be dangerous. It can, you know, sunder a life. It can open up a life. It can fracture. But also, learning about our own desirability can also be wonderful, but quite painful and quite difficult to come to terms with. And if we refuse it, I think the consequence of we've refused the grace, in other words, the consequences for our own sense of our own ordering of desire are quite significant indeed.
So it seems this category of dialectic is proving fruitful in revealing these multiple sides of what we're grappling with here. But Claire, you've got something further.
Just a question really about grace. Even though I'm very, very attracted to that idea, it's such a beautiful word, if nothing else. It sometimes can be quite easy to just sort of invoke it when you get to a point where you're not, not quite sure, where you're going. And so, just a bit of clarification: what does grace mean? Can grace be just? Is it? My sense is that say, Simon, the way you would use it, it's not separate from nature. It's not separate from. It does the love that a parent shows their child, or the love that a child receives from her parent, is that grace, or are you? In order to use the word grace, do you need to have operate with some distinction between natural human love, for example, and divine grace? And if not, if you don't want to make that distinction, then what are you well, it's not a case of what are you adding, because it's not adding something on top of something else. But I just would like to take this opportunity to raise that question. I know it's quite a fundamental one.
I'm not always seeing hands, but I think, David, you were keen to come in here. It was you who raised this.
I'll just say a little more how I was understanding that, which may not be how others would understand it. But I think there's a phenomenological level at which I'd like to begin as something that's like something that comes to us as a gift. So it doesn't have to necessarily be God's grace, although I think that's part of how, if we're thinking about, in this context, a theological context, and we certainly want to explore that aspect, but something that's I called it a unmerited given good, something that we can't say that we deserve, but it comes to us, and it's not a product of our human effort or striving. So I think I'd want to think about it in, first of all, kind of in those broad general terms. And you do see people like the philosopher David Cooper, who writes a lot about mystery, and he thinks that mystery can have the element of a grace. To go back to Fiona's reference to Scruton, he talks a lot about, beauty sometimes becomes a God substitute for Roger Scruton. Of course, many of the great romantic thinkers of the 19th century, beauty can be experienced as coming to us as a kind of grace. Now, is there, if you lose the God, you lose the sort of the giver in that respect. But there's a kind of phenomenology, I think, of gift that I would want to begin with. That's just my own take on it. So maybe Simon or Chuck or Sarah or anyone else who's spoken on this. Yeah,
that's exactly how I put it, David. Yeah.
Just one quick thing though on what Claire was saying too. It's interesting to think about say broadly theistic analogies to this. And, if you think about different understandings of serendipity or in some ways accident, there could be possible analogs there, or at least conversation pieces, bridge concepts to work between. So, that, Claire, a category like serendipity might be interesting there in that way. I'm just kind of thinking. I'm pretty comfy with the notion of grace, but I do think that it's interesting to think about other idioms in which to put phenomenologically similar things, if only as canny apologetic strategists by theologians like myself to invite people into the doors of the church. Ha ha ha.
So are there other threads than gift that we might want to introduce at this stage? We've got about 20 minutes of what we've planned to have together. Please, Sarah.
I wonder whether I might just link that notion back to a bit of unfinished business from John Cottingham's paper, which I found very interesting. So when he was citing Walter Hilton and then also Henry Moore, he spoke about the importance of both of those authors of desire being activated towards God, whilst the intellect, as it were, is set on one side. And this strikes me as having an etiology that goes back to Pseudo-Dionysius, in which one is taught that because God is beyond the mind, then, as it were, seeking to activate connection with that unknown God beyond the mind, one necessarily places oneself into a position of, as it were, naked longing, which is not intellectually active at the time of such desiring. And this strikes me as a very important strand in Western thinking about desire, in which there is at least an initial disjunction made between intellect and desire or will, such that the effect of the practice will be actually to enlarge or expand the intellect in relation to God long term. And I think this links up also with our notion of grace that's being reintroduced here, because if I seek to fix or control or orchestrate or organize my notion of my relation to God, I'm necessarily not being disrupted by that relationship, to put it in terms used by Jenny. So I think this is a point at which our question of grace also relates to our question of strategy or practice in relation to recontacting that well of metaphysical desire, which is God's gift.
Simon, I know you've got something, but since this was on John's point, I'm just going to come to John first and then come on to you, Simon. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that how interesting that point is from Sarah. And it suggests that the relation between desire and cognition is something that actually needs a lot more philosophical work. And I wondered if the point Sarah raised earlier about how modernity kind of trivializes desire or reduces it to something much less, is a function of it not being sufficiently au fait with this complexity of the relation between desire and cognition. I mean, typical consumerist modernity is just a matter of implanting certain desires through advertising and so on, which are then acted upon. And the notion that desire might be purified, for example, so as to yield a richer form of cognition in the long run, that's kind of entirely absent from the palette of modernity. I mean, I don't know, it might be a bit complacent to think that only a theistic or religious metaphysic would generate a better conception of desire.
I agree with that, actually, John. I mean, that's where I thought your paper was so interesting, because you were opening up this larger space in which, you know, God didn't just triumphantly appear, but which you were exploring our moral, aesthetic, and intimations of transcendence as a much wider territory in which something equivalent could occur.
Yeah,
I think that's an excellent strategy, particularly in our current philosophical milieu.
So Simon, then Fiona.
I just wanted to try out an idea going back to Chuck's comments about the advertising industry, because of course that's slightly predated by the advent of modern economics, and economics really is the lens through which I think so much common reflection on desire takes place. So every economics textbook will always begin with the fundamental axiom, the fundamental assumption that human wants are infinite, human desires are infinite, and the resources of the world are limited or lacking. So we start with a lack in the world. And therefore, economics is the science of allocation mechanisms for scarce resources according to efficiency. And so we're already then into a scenario where one's gain, the satisfaction of one person's desire is a loss for another. So it's zero sum, because there's a kind of, I say with big inverted commas, doctrine of creation here of insufficiency, that the world is just insufficient to human insatiable desires. And what this tends to, I think, skew our desires towards are what are sometimes called private goods or goods of appropriation, goods that I have insofar as you don't have. You know, my meal is mine insofar as it's not yours, as opposed to other kinds of goods we might desire. So, for example, public goods that are goods I can have insofar as they're shared, you know, Durham Cathedral, or goods of a different order that I think are the goods that we find more readily in religious traditions, which are the goods that we have insofar as we give them away. So you only have attention insofar as you give attention. You only have love insofar as you give love. And all our desire is orientated towards these goods of appropriation because of this anxiety that's created, this anxiety that drives desire, that there's never enough, that there are scarce resources, and therefore we must accumulate lest someone else beats us to it, that kind of thing. So economics really is enormously powerful and the engine behind advertising.
Fiona?
Yeah, I'm going to cancel my question and continue from what Simon's talking about here, which is so interesting. I mean, it reminds me of Heidegger and his claim that we've got to stop thinking in values if we're to somehow return to being and stop being forgetful of it. And when he talks about thinking in values, he's talking about economic values. He has, you know, quite a few German economists in mind at that point. And he's not saying that value across the board has to be rejected. It's just a certain kind of value that is to be comprehended solely in those economic terms. So I think that that's a really important point.
And fundamentally different logics ultimately being drawn out there. And back to you.
Me? Okay, yeah. So it's not just, I think this is all great. I think it's also that I was doing some stuff on the market economy for kids, for some of my students this semester, for my SINs. And what's interesting to think about are the way people produce and consume objects, and the degree to which people spend time producing and consuming objects really have expanded. And so I wonder if part of what the advertising industry is doing is not just creating new things for us to desire, but creating us as new kinds of creatures for whom our relationship to the world is increasingly, maybe exclusively, understood as a matter of desire for consumption of certain kinds. So it's not just the quantity of desiring that is changed in these conditions, but the quality of the kind of desiring we have. I just don't want that to go away. Think about the way in which people's identities are conferred on them by the goods that they purchase, versus people's identities 300 years ago when the means of production were mostly inside the home. It's stuff like that, right? And think about the way in which we think about just understanding the occupation of time through consumption and things like that. Even now to the point where we talk about things that would not have been construed as consumeristic events as consumeristic events now. And so in a way, I just don't want us to think we simply have to talk about how we all are continually seduced to buy new things. It's an anthropological change as well. That's all. Potentially.
Fiona, do you want to bring being back in?
No, I just wondered, Chuck, do you have an example of what you've just been talking about?
Sure. Think about the way in which increasing amounts of your life are mediated through cash exchanges, either physical cash exchanges or just cards. Think about the number of situations. So we had a puzzle in one of my classes this semester about what sorts of things are deserving of pay that do not get pay right now. And so, right, the whole region of what's called the ethics of care turns out to be an area of large-scale concern about this. To people who stay at home and care for children or elderly or just sick people, that seems like a non-commodified dimension of our lives, where people are effectively being unjustly handled by this because we are assuming they care and we are taking for granted their care without any compensation for that. And so there's lots of arguments about that. But and there are lots of good reasons for thinking in that way. The question is whether or not that relationship, if we move more towards a monetized understanding of the way in which our relationships are all going to be then turned into monetizable relationships, what does that do to us more? The other one would just be something around identity and the way that all of us pick our clothes or our glasses, or some of us our hairstyles, and how that selects for us a certain kind of identity. It signals in certain ways, not just to other people, but to ourselves. And I don't think that consumerism of that sort, that nature of desire, as mediated economically and in certain socially and culturally legible ways, goes back much more than a couple hundred years. I mean, yes, there was fashion, but fashion was much more constrained by sumptuary law and stuff like that, actually in a much more self-conscious way than we do now. Anyway, those are just two kinds of examples I'm thinking of.
There were various heads nodding all the way through that. So if there are further thoughts on this, yeah, David.
Yeah, this has got me thinking about, what does this say about our spiritual condition? I mean, there's kind of questions of causes. Is this a result of our spiritual condition, or does it contribute? It's probably a bit of both. But I was thinking here about Fiona's book project that she's working on, The End of Desire. So, I mean, part of the problem here is precisely the insatiability. It makes me think, Fiona has a really wonderful paper called Desire in the Spiritual Life, where she talks about Schopenhauer. And so it's kind of like a Schopenhauerian wheel of desire that people are caught up in, because there is no sort of like thing to rest in, to have a contentment or something to just like to behold, to appreciate, to not be sort of caught in sort of this wheel of desire. And so it seems like that consumerism, it's something important to investigate as speaking to our spiritual condition, the tempt. In many ways, I think it's the Pascalian distraction, where the next thing, the next fix, where we don't want to sit quietly in the room and contemplate and or like the Kierkegaardian crop rotation, so to speak, right? To go to someone near and dear to Claire's heart, it's that same kind of like restlessness of the spirit that doesn't know how to like rest in something or to be at rest, to be at home. And that's the whole rational choice model of economics is it regards everything as preferences to be maximized, right? It has a maximizing assumption. But why should there be a maximizing assumption? Why isn't it better to satisfy than to maximize? I think that's a beginning point of a more healthy spiritual life, that satisficing is better than maximizing. And so I don't know, that's just makes me think about, there's something deep about our modern spiritual condition in that predicament that you've highlighted, Chuck.
Simon?
Yeah, I think this is following on somewhat from David's point, an idea I'd like to try out maybe on Chuck, that I mean, the market and advertising kind of competes for our attention, but attention itself has been monetarized. Okay, so Google essentially is the market for our attention, and technology always is competing for our attention in quite physical ways. So, you know, here's my iPhone. I mean, I have a game I play with my 14-year-old where they're not allowed to use their phone at the dinner table. Of course they're not. But I put it on the table next to him and challenge him not to touch it. And he finds it almost impossible because, of course, it's, even if it's not lit up, it's calling for you all the time. He can't help but touch the wretched thing. Ask Claire, she's seen him doing this. But I mean, I think the point is that even our attention is monetarized in that sense now, technologically, which means that you know, our ability to desire is constantly marketized in that sense.
Sorry, I was gesturing, Chuck. Please go ahead.
Sorry, the screen doesn't have everybody's faces on it, so I didn't know. Yeah, no, I mean, what Simon is saying strikes me as really good. The other danger here from my perspective, and I know that Simon and I share a weird and perhaps boutique affection for John Milbank and his anger at bicycle shorts and everything. But one worry I have about that road is that we could kind of turn that into a polemic about modern desire and stuff. And in some ways, the trick for me is, yeah, there are lots of problems with the modern concept of desire, and in some ways it's quite paralyzing. But it's also that I don't want to simply turn it into a kind of reactionary thing where I kind of reject the capacity for the exercise of agency and stuff that being in this modern world has created. And so the puzzle is, again, not that there's a solution here or just a bugbear to kind of, you know, beat on with a big stick, but to think about our situation in terms of desire, which seems right to me, in terms of these energies, these economic and psychological and social energies, not only sculpting our desires, but also maybe sculpting us as desiring creatures of a certain sort, for its benefits and its dangers. That's my main thing. And so I just want to be wary of letting us go too quickly towards a kind of polemical side, where, you know, John Milbank waves at us happily and invites us to join him on the Twitter.
Claire, last thought perhaps.
Yeah, just developing that a little, well, echoing in a way. Listening to the discussion, our own longing for some better conception of desire, fuller conception of desire is often articulated in terms of getting back to something. I mean, there are lots of versions of that, the idea of the lost paradise, or Heidegger's sort of recovery of, you know, there are loads and loads of ways of thinking about it. But there's also that the tragic sense that it's not possible to go back. So we could perhaps think of the longing less in terms of nostalgia, but more in terms of a more kind of future-oriented or eschatological direction for this orientation to desire, and then to see that as really a repetition of an eschatological hope that we can see it in Plato, we can see it in so many historical figures. So not to say that, oh, we don't need to worry, you know, we can't go back to Plato, so let's not listen, but rather see it as a repetition of something that's reaching forwards, rather than having to see ourselves as having to reach back and somehow retrace our steps to something, which I'm just unsure about that rhetoric and how, whether it might just lead to well, either way, it can lead to disappointment actually, but I'm suspicious of the Milbank sort of nostalgia way of seeing things, and so perhaps to shift the tense or the temporality of the discussion might be a way of, yeah, non-identical repetition. Exactly, not getting very far away from Milbank after all. Yeah.
Friends, we are strictly speaking at 6:30. There's really quite a lot of continuing energy, but some folks may need to go to other engagements or commitments. Fiona, could we continue? Do you want to give us an extra 10 minutes? Or
I was going to say something in response to what Claire had just said, but I think she put it so well that I thought it would be a really excellent way to end the proceedings. But if anybody wants to go on for a tiny bit longer, I'm happy to do that too. But I think we've just had such a fantastic day and made so much progress as well. And I just wanted to thank everybody for being so brilliant. And it's just been so inspiring.
Yeah,
really great. Thank you so much.
So just so nice to see so many old friends gathered together in one place. We haven't had quite this configuration before, so it's been a real joy to have you all on my screen together, even if we're not gathered in person. So thank you so much to everyone for coming. So appreciate and value your contributions and the time you've put into preparing talks, and as well as being here with us this afternoon. Thank you so much to all of you, and thanks Amy for brilliant chairing. It's really great to have you to help us navigate these questions.
no problem. It was a treat for me, and it was resonant. I was trying to read Leisure as the Basis of Culture as my lockdown book, and I got halfway through, recognised the modern university far too strongly, and set it aside in despair. So I will return to it, having been have it re-recommended to me so strongly.
I'm just going to stop the recording now, and then that can be the formal end to the afternoon.